Hello, George. We're pleased to see you. We were saving a seat for you. All right, as you all settle in, Christian says we're good to go there. Need to settle something real quick, once for all. I know some people go, whoa, I can't make a decision once for all. Here it is. Hi, Rick. No, he's not coming in. He's bringing us out, I think. Anyway, settle once for all. Here we go. Tough decision. Make your minds up. Stick with it for the rest of your lives. Is anybody in the room particularly disturbed if young Ben cries, moans, groans, passes gas, or anything else while we're doing this? Other than Jordan, anybody else? The decision is unanimous. Don't ever worry about him disturbing us. Now, when Jordan does it, not so much, but if we could limit that, and I know after all these years it's too late, but we can hope. All right, that's settled. I just know how young parents feel. They always worry, is my kid not bothering anybody, right? All right, so we've settled that. Ann and Jordan want to be back in church. We're glad they're here. They're more committed than many, many folks to church, and so we need to encourage them as they walk these early days of parenthood and figuring out how to interact out in the world with things that they're worried about disturbing, and they're not. All right, let's do our recap first before we read our biblical text for the evening. Thinking about where we are in the book of Hebrews. Finally, if you remember from last week, the author has finally been able to return back to the discussion of Jesus' connection to Melchizedek. If you remember, he started that way back in chapter 5, figured that his audience couldn't handle it, took a detour, scolded them, and then has slowly been easing his way back into it. And last week we saw the beginning of that discussion as he finally came back to Melchizedek. One of the things he was doing in the first part of chapter 7 was he was describing this unending nature of Melchizedek's ministry. There was no beginning, there was no end. Now, remember, that's symbolic, not literal. He doesn't mean he lived forever. The picture is we don't know when it started, we don't know when it ended. So from our perspective, looking back, in our case now 3,500 years, or 4,000 years, how long did his ministry last from what we can tell? It was forever. So that's where he's been kind of focusing on, the nature of Melchizedek's ministry and beginning to make the connection now forward to Jesus. Doing so, he also mentioned Melchizedek's twofold kingship. Now, we know from Genesis he's the prince of Salem, but the author of Hebrews wants to make sure you understand what the words mean. What does Salem mean? What does Melchizedek mean? And so he's talked about him being the king of two things. He's the king, first of all, of righteousness, and he's also the king of peace. And that it's by way of righteousness that we attain peace with God, ultimately, theologically. But remember, he's making these symbolic connections to Jesus and his ministry. He also mentioned last week, and for us, the beginning of chapter 7, that interaction between Melchizedek and Abraham. And by bringing that up, he pointed out that Melchizedek's ministry is greater than that of the Levites, who are descendants of Abraham. That they, in essence, also bowed to Melchizedek when Abraham did. And so he's established what Melchizedek did, what he was like, and what his relationship is to Abraham, and then ultimately, really, all of Abraham's descendants. And so now, the rest of chapter 7, we're going to get through part of it tonight. We'll finish it up in a few weeks. The rest of chapter 7 is drawing this comparison between Jesus and Melchizedek. So we've had a comparison between Melchizedek and Abraham / Levites. Now let's talk about Melchizedek and Jesus. And in one sense, to make his case, what the author does, here's your new word for the night if you don't recognize the word, the author exegetes. He gets the meaning out of the text. Remember, that's always our goal when we do Bible reading. We don't want to read into it, tell it what it means. We want to read out of it. We want it to tell us what it means. And so the author is, in this passage particularly tonight, essentially exegeting, explaining the meaning of Psalm 110. It's all about Psalm 110, and particularly one verse in Psalm 110. It's been mentioned already earlier in the book. It's been mentioned already in the previous chapter. Here he is now going into it in greater depth. So you really want to get a good sense of what's going on in the book of Hebrews. It would be good for you to go back and study Psalm 110 closely, because the author keeps going back to it. Let me show you what I mean. Let's start at verse 11, and we'll read on down to verse 22. Now, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than one named after the order of Aaron? For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. For the one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe, from which no one has ever served at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. This becomes more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become a priest not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life. For it is witnessed of him, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. For on the one hand, a former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness, for the law made nothing perfect. But on the other hand, a better hope is introduced, through which we draw near to God. And it was not without an oath, for those who formerly became priests were made such without an oath. But this one was made a priest with an oath by the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind, you are a priest forever. This makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant. And so here's the author weaving in and out of Genesis, Leviticus, Exodus, as well as Psalm 110. His argument, of course, is big picture for the book that Jesus is what? Greater than all that stuff. But he's going to use that stuff to prove it. And as you look at verse 11, you notice the very first word, at least in our English translation, because it's the first word in the Hebrew translation, now. Now, the word introduces the next phase of his argument. Because of what I've said, now this. It's almost like the Hebrew equivalent of the word therefore. If you read in the Old Testament and you notice, especially in Moses' writings, either the word now at the beginning of a sentence or and then, that's this word. The writer of Hebrews is writing, even though he's writing in Greek, like a Hebrew writer. And so he's even picking up nuances in terms of writing style from the Old Testament. And so what he's doing is pointing back to what we looked at last week, verses 1 to 10, and assuming that Abraham's tithe they gave to Melchizedek, assuming that that tithe to Abraham, or from Abraham, proves Melchizedek is superior over the Levites, the argument then moves to the need for someone like him, not them. Remember, if Melchizedek receives a tithe from Abraham, that's Abraham acknowledging Melchizedek's greater than him. Therefore, any descendant of Abraham's can't be greater than him either. And so if these other priests aren't that great, we need somebody like Melchizedek for our salvation, not like them. So assuming he's made that case already to them and clear, he's now moving forward. And he has to, because notice what he says there in verse 11. Perfection was not attainable under the Levites' ministry. Perfection was not attainable. Now, very simply put, what the author means is it could not save the Jews. even though that law, that system, had given them the capital L law. It couldn't save them. Now, let that sink in. For all these people, and I grew up in a church that preached this, oh, God is going to save the Jews by the law. What's the writer of Hebrews saying? Never could. Never could. Because that other system could never perfect them, could not save them, what is required is a priest from the line of Melchizedek, not Aaron, is going to be needed for salvation. So you want to think about going back to Judaism, let me tell you, that system doesn't work. You want to go back to that sacrificial system because you think it'll save you. It never has. Because they were in Abraham, and Abraham acknowledged Melchizedek was greater, we need to look for somebody like Melchizedek. And so he's kicking the pillars out from underneath them. Every argument that they could come up with to go back to Judaism, he's knocking them out. 1, 2, 3. Right? It's kind of like going into the ring with Mike Tyson in his heyday. Some of you going, who? Some of you else remember, first 30 seconds, he won, 3 or 4 fights. Several others he won in the first round. I saw a clip the other day of, I forget who the no-name fighter was fighting him. Probably did it for the money. 40 seconds in or 30 seconds in, he's on the ground once. 45 seconds in, he's on the ground twice. And a minute and a half in, his coach or whatever throws in the towel and says, get him out of there. That's what the author's doing here to Hebrew thinking. You want to go back to that? Bang. That won't work. What else you got? Want to go back to that? Bang. And it keeps falling down. Basically what he's saying here already just in verse 11, we're not even halfway through the book yet. What he's saying is, based on just this argument alone, there's no reason for these people to go back. We're moved beyond in our argument that they wanted to stop at the road sign instead of going to the destination. Now he's going, no, you've been to the destination. I've shown you it isn't all that it was all cracked up to be. Why go back? There's no point. And so that one couldn't perfect you. Has to come from somebody other than Aaron. Then he goes a step further. And again, should rock the world of these people who argue the Jews are going to be saved in a different way than Christians. Because he goes on in verse 12 and says, look, when one priesthood is superseded by another, when the Aaronic or Levite priesthood has been superseded by this coming Melchizedek priesthood, so is the law that is associated with it. If we're looking for somebody greater than Aaron's tribe, we're looking for a law that's greater than Aaron's law. So it's not just the Aaron priesthood. It's not just the sacrificial system. It's the whole piece that is being replaced. If the author is correct, and hopefully we believe he is, since our doctrine of inspiration says this is from God ultimately as the ultimate author, if the author is correct, that means with the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, the entire Mosaic law has been replaced. It's gone. There's no going back. There's nowhere to go to. Some of you who are more experienced adults in the room, your childhood home is gone. It's not that mom and dad don't live there anymore. The house is gone. There's nothing to go back to. Right? It's like people who flee from war. Once the war's over, the immigrants want to go back. There's nothing to go back to. When the priesthood is ended, so is the law that was with that priesthood. Mosaic law is gone. In fact, he suggests in verse 12 that that law was always meant to be temporary. The Mosaic law and the sacrificial system of the Levites was always meant to be temporary. It was a placeholder. In fact, Paul says in Galatians, when he's dealing with Judaizers, people who want to go back to the law, Paul says, no, the law was intended, didn't turn out to be, was intended to be a guardian. is what the ESV says. Some of your translations might say tutor. It was just meant to hold a place, to protect you, right? If you know there's rules, even if you're tempted to break them, you're a little more thoughtful about breaking them than if there was no rule at all, right? What do you have when you take away all rules? Chaos, anarchy. The rules are there to keep us in line, but the rules are not there, according to verse 11, to save us. So, Aaronic, Levitical priesthood, superseded. Mosaic law, superseded. There's nothing for you to go back to now, is what he's telling them. And then finally, in verse 13, he makes the shift formally to Jesus. Verse 13 begins this connection to Jesus and all this. How is Jesus like Melchizedek? How has Jesus replaced the Levitical priests? How has the gospel replaced the law, and so forth? So he's making the connection now to Jesus and all this. And it's interesting, the very first thing he mentions is that like Melchizedek, Jesus belonged to another tribe. He's totally unlike the previous system. Previous system required you to be from the tribe of Levi. Jesus isn't even from there, nor was Melchizedek. In fact, he goes on and says in verse 14 that Jesus descended from the tribe of Judah. So the author wants you to know for certain he's not Levite. Now, here's a side note. We don't know exactly when the book of Hebrews is written, probably mid to late 60s. Many of the New Testament books have been written by this point, but they're not necessarily all in widespread circulation, and they're not all universally accepted yet. Yet notice what the author doesn't even have to defend. The lineage of Jesus. What does everybody assume they already know? He's from the tribe of Judah. Messianic prophecy, he's a lion of the tribe of Judah. Davidic prophecy, he's a descendant of David. All that is already known and accepted. And he's assuming his audience, who's thinking about leaving all this, also knows that. So they know that he's the fulfillment of a prophecy. They know he's the descendant of David. And they're still thinking about going to do something else. Ever met somebody who heard the truth, know the truth, and didn't care about the truth? So help them God. That no matter how convinced they are, it's not enough to convince them to be different. That's these people. They know who Jesus is. They know what he's done. They know what the claims are. They know what the evidence is. And the author still has to walk them through it. So he says, no, he's from the tribe of Judah. And as he points out in verse 14, there's nothing in the Old Testament about a line of priests coming from this tribe. So it's clear Jesus' connection to a priesthood has nothing to do with Levites, and in one sense, has nothing to do with his being from Judah. He is not a descendant of your priesthood. Why is that important? He has no connection to the inferior priesthood. He's clearly stated the Levites are inferior. The law associated with them, inferior. Jesus isn't connected to that. He must be connected to something else. And that something else, in verse 15, is undeniable. It's the advent of Jesus' ministry. It's the beginning. You see that in verse 15? This becomes even more evident when another priest, Jesus, arises in the likeness of Melchizedek. When Jesus' ministry is out there and on display, there's no denying it has nothing to do with the Levites. And there's no denying he's proposing there's another law. And it says in verse 16 that he came in the likeness of Melchizedek, not Aaron. Not only is he not from him, his ministry is not like his. Now, notice that word likeness. Likeness, just like it's used in Genesis 1:26. Let us make man in our image. In our likeness, let us create him, male and female. That language of likeness, as we've said now several times, think about Melchizedek for the last few weeks. The connection is meant to be symbolic, not genetic. He's like Melchizedek, he's not Melchizedek. Again, go back to what I said a few weeks ago. Again, people I knew growing up who argued that Melchizedek was Jesus before he came to earth as a baby. The language of the book of Hebrews doesn't permit that. It's the symbolism that is the point of the author's argument here, not a literal connection to him by descent, or not a literal connection to him by first manifestation, later manifestation. It's the symbolism of it. And what is the key symbolic measure of his likeness to Melchizedek? It's his immortality. His immortality, according to verse 16, is the basis of his ministry. Melchizedek didn't have a beginning and end because we don't know his story. Jesus doesn't have a beginning because he's deity. And his ministry doesn't have an end. Why? The resurrection. They tried to kill him and he came back. And thus, what happens to his ministry? It continues. That's the connection. That's the likeness to Melchizedek. That's what makes Jesus' ministry greater than the others. The author, spoiler alert, will keep going on this for a few more chapters. He'll talk about the fact that the other priest needs another priest to give him a sacrifice. He'll talk about the other priest always had to give a sacrifice, and then next year give another sacrifice. Jesus doesn't need any of that. He's greater in every way, but the basis of his ministry alone is greater. It's eternal. And to prove his point, verse 17 then, he quotes Psalm, which one? 110, verse 4. Quotes Psalm 110 to prove the immortality or the eternality of Jesus' ministry. And he points out that in that verse, while there's a poet writing it down, the person speaking is whom? Look at verse 4 or verse 17, but Psalm 110, verse 4. Who's the speaker? It's God. Do you see that? For it is witnessed of him, you, somebody's talking to the Messiah in eternity past, has to be God. Later on, when we get down to verse 21, the author's going to make sure you don't miss that because he's going to spell it out black and white. But it's already there implied. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. It's God who is making this decision. It's God who is announcing this ministry. And so, Jesus is in the likeness of Melchizedek. Melchizedek's greater than the Levites, so therefore Jesus must be what? He's got to be greater than them. He's got to be divine also. Then he comes back and says, okay, let's talk about something else I introduced for us tonight in the first paragraph. That's the law. Let's make sure we understand that Jesus is not part of that at all. Verse 18 clearly points out that the law's requirement for priests to descend from the Levites has ended. If we have a new priest, we have a new law. The law that required any priest to come from Levi is gone. Therefore, the priest doesn't have to come from Levi. And then he just straight up says what was implied a little bit ago for us. The law, the one he's talking about, the one that says it must be a Levite. He says that law was, and it's almost, you start looking for clouds to make sure you're not going to be struck by lightning. He says that law was weak and useless. Now, I don't know about you, saying that out loud makes me a little nervous. Because we are rightly trained or ingrained in our minds to treat the Old Testament with incredible care, aren't we? If you've been around with me my 10 years here at Doorway, how much time have we spent in the Old Testament? Wednesday nights, about the equivalent of half of that at least. To make sure we understand the law, the Old Testament, the writings of Moses and the prophets also are important for us. As one of my colleagues says, some of you have met him, Pete Link, the Old Testament is about Jesus and it's written for you. Here's the author of Hebrews straight up saying it. But to say that the law is weak and useless, I'm kind of going, if he's in a room with us, what would we all do? Step to the side to get away, just in case. But if the God that we're talking about, who says to the Messiah, you'll be a priest after the order of Melchizedek, if that God is the inspirer of the biblical text, guess who knows better than anybody that law was weak and useless? And so ultimately, it's God who is saying this through the pen of the writer. And of course, going back to what he said earlier, now he makes clear in verse 19, the first part of verse 19, what made it weak and useless? Nothing was made perfect by it. Nothing was made perfect by it. If it can't make you perfect, it's inferior, isn't it? It's weak. And he's maybe stating for dramatic effect, right? Rhetoricians do it all the time. Overstate your case. Not only is it weak, it's useless. But what's he trying to do with his audience? Startle them enough to get them to stop and to think about what they're about to do. So if somebody told you taking that medicine will not do you any good at all, most of you would stop taking the medicine. So he says it was weak and it was useless. Nothing made perfect by it. So what was its purpose? Again, we alluded to it in the first paragraph. Here it's becoming clear for us. But let's just spell it out in the kind of our modern way of thinking a little bit. What the author is making the point here is that law, the one that was meant to be a guardian, Paul says, that law with the Levites and the whole sacrificial system was meant to correct the people, not connect the people. I know that's very preacherly. It works. It sings. It's memorable. It didn't come to correct. It came to, or connect. It came to correct. What I mean, what the author meant, is it was never meant to perfect you, to bring you to God. What was the law always meant to do? To keep you from straying too far from God. It was always the bumper rails at the bowling alley when the little kids are learning how to bowl. Can you play the game forever like that? Except for Jessica, the masked woman in the back row. See, you were fine until you went and had to jump in the game. Come on in, the water's fine. Dun, 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 dun. It was never meant to take you to God. It was to remind you that you needed God. Think about it a step further. Think about what we've talked about Exodus a little bit. Think about what you all know from reading, particularly Leviticus and other Old Testament books. Think about it. In one sense, that sacrificial system actually kept people apart from God. You go, wait a minute, I thought I was supposed to bring me to God. What did he just tell you? It can't bring you to God. In fact, the sacrificial system, if you kept it strictly and literally, how often would you be at the temple making a sacrifice? Always, right? You could hardly leave without sinning and have to go back and make another sacrifice. And so rather than bringing you to God, what did the law actually remind you of? How far from God you really were. And that fear that, man, maybe I did something and you go back and do another sacrifice just in case. It's not bringing you to God. In one sense, it's reminding you there's a wall between you and God. In fact, not only is there this symbolic wall of sin, in the temple, think of the construction. Where is God symbolically in the temple? In the Holy of Holies. And what's between you and him? The veil that you can't get through. One man's allowed in. And he can only go once a year. So if he can only go to God once a year, and you're going to come back and make the case later in the book, what hope do you have? The law is actually keeping you away from God, not bringing you to God. That's why the end of verse 19, the second part of it, tells us a better hope has been brought by Christ. There was no hope in that one. Here's a better hope. Because as he's going to argue in chapter 9, the beginning of chapter 10, it's through the ministry of Jesus and only through the ministry of Jesus that people can finally draw near to God. And think how many times, we mentioned this a while back, in Hebrews, the author talks about let us draw near. Let us draw near to God. You couldn't do it before. Now you can. Because what did Jesus do to that veil? Rip that bad boy down. And the door is now forever open. That's a better hope. Why do you want to go back? That would be foolish. And as if that's not a strong enough argument, he says, look, on top of all that, everything that's been accomplished in this message so far has all been accomplished because of God's oath. God swore an oath. God made a promise. In fact, he's now connecting us here for the moment to a thought he started back in Hebrews chapter 6, verses 17 and 18. You see how the writer of Hebrews' mind works? He says something and he comes back and he finishes it. And then he weaves something new into it. And then he goes forward and he comes back and he goes forward. Why is Hebrews such a complicated book for some people to read? Because they don't try to keep up with his argument. They just try to let the words wash over them, and it doesn't work that way. Plus, what does the author assume of you as a reader? You know the Old Testament. And so if the key to understanding and fully appreciating Jesus' ministry, according to Hebrews, is the Old Testament, how weak and deficient are so many of our Christian friends? They know the gospel, and we're to come based on what little we know. But what's the author's argument been here? Don't settle for a little bit. You want more. Don't fill up on the bread before they bring the main course. And so God made an oath he comes back around to. And then he points out that the Levitical priesthood, the one of the Old Testament, was established without an oath. You ever notice that in the Old Testament reading? No, of course you didn't. That's why the later book explains it for us. Levites were established by command, but not by an oath or a promise of God. But this one was. So what might that mean? Why might the author be bringing that up here? His point is, and he said it now 2 different times already in tonight's passage, that Levitical priesthood was never intended by God to be salvific. When the Bible talks about the plan of salvation laid before the foundation of the earth, he never meant the Levites. Before there ever was a Levitical priesthood, God already had a priest lined up and ready to come. That's the one he swore to, not the Levites. But on the other hand, verse 21, Jesus was made a priest, now clearly said, by God, by God's oath. In fact, quoting Psalm 110 again, he points out that God did what? Swore an oath. Remember, he made a big deal out of swearing an oath earlier. Here it is. God swore an oath that this one is the priest forever. And thus, for the audience that he's writing to reject Christ's priesthood is to outright reject God's will. They want to go back to save their lives, and the author is telling them, if you go back, you've lost your life. In fact, remember what he told them back in the warning passage in chapter 6? If you leave, what? There's no restoring you. You're dead. It's here. And then perhaps the greatest verse in all the 12 we're looking at tonight, verse 22, it's Jesus' ministry as the priest that is the guarantee of a better covenant. He's a better hope, it says in one verse, and he's a guarantee, it says at the end of the passage. What makes Jesus the better guarantee? It's all because God promised it. God told them to do the sacrificial system, but he didn't promise them it'd save them. But God promised them this. This priest is the one who's the priest forever. Why would you want to go back to the old days? Let's go ahead and pray and get ready to depart. Heavenly Father, Lord, we come tonight and we thank you for the clear thinking of the writer of Hebrews, for the insight you provide through his pen into how we should read and understand the Old Testament, to understand our place and our connection, and to understand the superiority of Christ in every way. Lord, take these words, use them to encourage us, to give us better and greater hope. Lord, use them to remind us in our weak and dark moments that we have a better guarantee. Our hope is not in some priest who is a sinner or in our ability to give all the sacrifices we must give. Our hope is in the perfect, the best priest who ministers on our behalf forever. May we find our confidence, our comfort, and our hope in him. And Lord, may we give him all the glory and honor and praise, not only for eternity, according to Revelation 5, but for every moment until then, according to the rest of Scripture. It's for all this we ask in his name. Amen.